Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Bhaskar and Keeanga, for your remarks. Okay. We're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, the Sanders, Groundswell. I think these two phenomena, as Keeanga was referring to, are really part of a global process of revolt that has begun. The first signs were the Arab Spring, the Tunisian and Egyptian revolution. And then in the United States, we had the Wisconsin public sector uprising, which did not succeed. And that itself, I think I agree with Keeanga, each of these deserves its own time to discuss. And we can discuss why that did not succeed. But what's important, what should be important in our eyes, was that we had a massive labor uprising. There's clearly a groundswell within the rank and file of the labor movement itself. And BLM itself has marked a turn for a new generation, a real turn for new American activists. It's signaling a rebirth of a new movement for Black rights and brown rights. And what's remarkable, really, about the BLM movement is that many young activists have risen in confidence and have had the courage to stand up against a lot of the entrenched leadership of Black establishment. And I recall just one incident to us all when Al Sharpton went to Akai Gurley's funeral. The people there said to Al Sharpton, "Go away, we don't want your traveling circus here." And this year, this real shift in consciousness that is taking place has been captured by the Bernie Sanders campaign. And as Bernie went all around the country declaring himself as a socialist and calling for a political revolution against the billionaire class, something a lot of people hadn't expected happened, which is that in the heartland of America, the seat of global capitalism, working people responded in great numbers. Tens of millions of people are angry at capitalism. They may not call it capitalism yet, many of them, but they are angry at the status quo. They're angry at the domination of corporation, at the brazen way in which the billionaire class and the banksters looted the economy and yet were the very ones to get rewarded, while working people were left with a string of foreclosure crisis, student debt, and many other, in just a myriad of problems that they're facing. But of course, it didn't just come from this particular economic crisis. It's been a process unfolding under capitalism for decades. And if you look at the issues that have affected workers and Black people, a lot of it is tied to the Democratic Party establishment, and the Republican establishment. We know that there is enormous anger against trade deals like NAFTA, which have been part and parcel of a massive wave of deindustrialization across America, the massive loss of jobs that will never come back, the destruction of unions. And we know that specifically the oppression, the new wave of oppression against Black people has been carried out in a very systematic way. We know, Ms. Michelle Alexander and others have talked about the crime bill, the destruction of welfare, and so on. But it is not just that. It's the overall vicious attack on working people. And Keeanga correctly mentioned the attack on wages that has gone on for decades. Why is it that the wealth in society is growing at an unprecedented level, and yet wages are stagnating? It's not working people who are gaining from this system, and it's obviously, the biggest brunt has been suffered by Black and brown people. But I think it's important to recognize that the oppression of Black people, women, immigrants, all these specific oppressions that we observe, they are necessary. And I'm not the first one to point this out. They are necessary methods of social control. And these methods of social control are necessary for a system, that is capitalism, that is fundamentally exploitative of our workers. And Keeanga herself has many times in her speeches pointed out that the systematic racism and sexism, the fact that women still don't have equal pay for equal work, all of these specific oppressions give cover to the fact that there is a bigger theft happening in society, the theft of our livelihoods, the theft of our wages, the theft of all the fruits of our labor that we go to work every day to produce profits for the capitalist class. That is the bigger theft that is happening. And in fact, it is these broad-based attacks against the 99% that are also fueling the main energy into the Trump campaign. It is anger against the corporate establishment. And really, the topic of left unity, to my mind, I interpret that at this moment as what is the way forward for the left. It is clear that the Democratic Party establishment is getting ready to do everything they can in order to anoint Clinton as the Democratic Party nominee. And I know that there is fear of Trump, and we cannot ignore that. The Trump agenda is extremely dangerous, and it is horrifying. We have to fight against this. And of course, we need mass campaigns against Trump. We need mass campaigns to go to the RNC, the Republican National Convention, and let everybody around the world know that American working people do not buy into Trump's agenda. And we need to connect these campaigns against Trump with the demands for decent living wage jobs, for the right to unionize, for programs for public school investment, green energy, and the expansion of the labor movement. But we cannot build these movements in a real way if we keep ourselves isolated and do not grapple with the electoral question this year. We need our mass movements to be independent of the Democratic and Republican stranglehold. But in order to do that, in order to actually be successful in winning any one of the single demands on Bernie's platform, we will need organized movements. We will need organizations. And we know that the Democratic Party has proved itself to be incapable and unwilling to be that vehicle for us to get organized. I know everybody knows about me as the elected socialist in Seattle. But the reason we were able to win as a tiny force compared to the domination of the Democratic Party in Seattle was because we are organized. It's because I was not an isolated, well-meaning individual, but as a member of Socialist Alternative, which is a democratically organized group around the nation with a cohesive way of working towards a single-minded goal, but those goals are decided through democratic discussions and debates within our organization. And that is why when Bernie was contemplating a run as a presidential candidate, we urged him to run as an independent and not through the Democratic Party. And he did choose that path to run as a Democrat, and we disagreed with him. But at the same time, it is extremely critical to recognize that the echo that he has received all across the country is the most important. That's the sign that times are changing and people are looking for an independent agenda and a way to fight back against corporations. And this is a conversation that especially young people want to engage in. I don't know how many of you have seen this poll that came out only days ago, which says that two things, that 65% of likely voters are open to a candidate other than Clinton or Trump. But more importantly, 91% of those under the age of 28 say that they want an independent candidate as an alternative to Trump and Clinton. But with our victories in Seattle and with the echo that Bernie has got, we know it is possible to run anti-corporate, pro-working class campaigns, without taking a penny from corporations. But that is not the only important component. It is important to run independent of corporations, but it is important to run independent of the parties that represent the corporations. And that is why it is really critical for us to connect the question of building our mass movements on the left to the question of building our own organizations and breaking ourselves from the two-party stranglehold, not in the abstract, but in actuality. And we know that the Democratic Party is not going to shift its loyalties away from big business, away from Wall Street, towards working class people, simply because tens of millions of people are clamoring for it. It is, this is a question I would pose to everybody, that if the Democratic Party's priority was to defeat Trump, then why isn't it that they haven't done everything in their power to promote the candidacy of Sanders, who, by every poll, shows that he's capable of delivering a major defeat to Trump were he to be the Democratic candidate. And in reality, and this is what we have to recognize, while there are differences between the Democratic and Republican parties, for the Democratic Party establishment, a far bigger priority is to marginalize the working class agenda and make sure that the interests of big business are put in front and center. That is the problem we face, and that is why, precisely because we are seeing this amazing moment opening up, it is important that the left build united efforts to break away from the Democratic and Republican Party stranglehold and build our own independent strength and run independent working class candidates that are connected to mass movements and fuel our energy into mass movements, not channel it back into parties that represent the billionaire class. I wanted to quote Michelle Alexander, who has done an excellent job exposing, re-exposing the racial dynamics at work in America. And she recently wrote in The Nation that she, quote, holds little hope that a political revolution will occur within the Democratic Party without a sustained outside movement forcing true transformational change. I am inclined to believe that it would be easier to build a new party than to save the Democratic Party from itself. On Facebook, she put it another way. She said, quote, I do not endorse Bernie Sanders as a candidate because, and this is many weeks ago, I do not endorse Bernie Sanders as a candidate because I do not believe the Democratic Party can be saved from itself, and therefore I will not endorse any Democratic candidate, but I believe it is critically important that he is helping to build a popular consensus in favor of political revolution. I endorse the revolution, unquote. I would argue, and I think Michelle would be interested in this discussion herself, is that there is another way. Bernie can, and I have a few more things to say about this because I know everybody will immediately say, well, Bernie is not going to run independent, and I recognize that. But bear with me. If Bernie were to run as an independent candidate to November, it would actually provide a basis for a beginning of a discussion for an independent party. And in this election year, it would make sure that Trump would not be able to monopolize the anti-establishment vote. That is absolutely critical. If we are worried about the rise of right-wing ideologies, then we on the left need to do everything in our power to limit the political space that Trump has this year. And the only way of limiting that space is to provide a left-wing alternative, not to prop up Clinton, who is the very epitome of why people are being driven towards Trump. And if Bernie was to run as a Green Party candidate with Jill Stein, if Bernie was to run with Jill Stein, my sisters and brothers, that would be nothing short of a political earthquake this year. We have launched a petition. Myself and Socialist Alternative have launched a petition at movementforbernie.org where we are urging, the petition urges Bernie to run as an independent through November if he is blocked by the Democratic Party establishment. And so far Bernie has not shown any likelihood that he would do that, but it is important that we recognize that while Bernie has done has shown that there is a huge opening for the left all across this country, we cannot hold our movement hostage if he decides to remain with the Democratic Party and endorse Clinton. We need to break away from that, refuse to whitewash that if that were to happen, and demand an independent course to be charted for our movement, Bernie or no Bernie. And I urge you all to join us in calling on Bernie this year to run as an independent. Movement for Bernie petition already has more than 30,000 signatures. And I know that there are many, many people out there who are thinking, especially young people, who are thinking very seriously about politics and really want to be part of shaping a historic movement of activism, of real fight back against inequality and against capitalism itself. But we cannot hold our movements on pause every time the Democratic Party has a corporate candidate running in the presidential election year. We have to keep building our movement every year, including in the presidential years. Thank you.